In the spring of 1775, there was no United States of America. There was no Declaration of Independence. There was no national flag recognized by the world. There was no president, no capital city, no American army in the modern sense. There were 13 British colonies along the Atlantic coast, tied to an empire that stretched across oceans, guarded by the most powerful navy on earth, and ruled by a king most colonists had once called their own. And yet, before the year was over, farmers would fire on British regulars from behind stone walls. A royal governor in Virginia would offer freedom to enslaved people who joined the king's side. Delegates in Philadelphia would petition for peace while creating a continental army. George Washington would ride north to command men who did not yet agree on what country they belonged to. American forces would seize forts, surround Boston, invade Canada, and end the year in a snowstorm beneath the walls of Quebec. That is what makes 1775 so dangerous and so human. It was not a clean year. It was not a year when everyone knew where history was going. It was a year of half-decisions and crossed thresholds. Men who still called themselves loyal subjects took up arms against the king's soldiers. Moderates begged for reconciliation while their neighbors dug siege lines. British commanders tried to restore order without understanding how quickly authority was slipping from their hands. The war did not begin with a grand declaration. It began with roads, rumors, gunpowder, night riders, frightened towns, and a question no one could answer in time. Once blood was spilled, could the old world be put back together? To understand the American Revolution, we have to begin before independence was inevitable. We have to begin in a colony where resistance had become a habit, where military stores were hidden in barns and taverns, where town meetings carried more local authority than royal proclamations, and where the countryside had already learned to listen for alarm bells in the dark. We begin in Massachusetts. By early 1775, Boston was a city under watch. British troops moved through its streets in red coats, their boots striking stone and frozen mud. Their presence meant to remind the town that Parliament's authority was not a matter for debate. Warships sat in the harbor, soldiers guarded official buildings, merchants, laborers, apprentices, sailors, and shopkeepers moved around them with the forced calm of people who had learned to hide anger in public. For years, Massachusetts had been a center of resistance. The Stamp Act crisis, the Townshend duties, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and the Coercive Acts had hardened positions on both sides. Parliament believed punishment would restore obedience. Many colonists believed punishment proved that their liberties were in danger. The royal governor and military commander in Massachusetts was General Thomas Gage. He was not a cartoon tyrant. He had served in North America for years, had married into an American family, and knew the colonies better than many men in London. But he also had a job: restore royal authority in a province where royal authority was becoming almost theoretical outside Boston. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress, operating outside the royal system, had begun organizing supplies and militia. Powder, muskets, cannon, cartridges, tents, and food were gathered in towns beyond Boston. The men who stored these materials did not always use the word rebellion. They spoke of defense. They spoke of rights. They spoke of being ready if British troops came. And Gage knew they were preparing. His problem was almost impossible. If he did nothing, resistance would look stronger every week. If he struck too hard, he might begin the very war he was trying to prevent. London wanted order. Boston gave him rumors. The countryside gave him silence. And somewhere beyond the city, in towns like Concord, colonists were hiding military stores that could support an army. Inside Boston, Patriot leaders kept watch. Dr. Joseph Warren, a physician and one of the most important resistance figures in the city, gathered intelligence through a network of informants. Paul Revere, a silversmith and messenger, carried information between Boston and the countryside. Samuel Adams and John Hancock, two men British authorities viewed as especially dangerous, were staying in Lexington, outside the city. The road from Boston to Concord became more than a road. It became the line along which empire and resistance would test each other. Gage decided to act. His target was Concord, about 20 miles away, where colonial military stores were believed to be hidden. He would send troops at night, seize or destroy the supplies, and return quickly. The expedition was supposed to be disciplined. It was supposed to avoid plunder. It was supposed to be a controlled assertion of authority. But by April 1775, secrecy in Massachusetts was almost impossible. Patriot observers noticed British preparations. Boats were made ready. Officers moved with unusual purpose. Soldiers received orders. In Boston, people who had been watching the army for months felt the air change. On the night of April 18th, Joseph Warren decided the warning had to go out. The countryside needed to know the regulars were coming. The story is often remembered as one rider, one horse, one midnight cry. But the alarm of April 18th and 19 was not the work of one man. It was a network. It was lanterns, ferrymen, watchers, messengers, church bells, signal guns, and local riders who knew every road between Boston and Concord. Paul Revere mattered, but he was not alone. Joseph Warren sent Revere across the Charles River toward Charlestown. He also sent William Dawes by the land route through Boston Neck. The famous lanterns in the steeple of Old North Church were not a message to every sleeping farmer in Massachusetts. They were a backup signal to patriots in Charlestown. British troops were moving by water. Revere crossed the river in the dark, passing near British ships, the water black and cold around him. Dawes took the longer and more dangerous land route, slipping through a city watched by soldiers. Both men were trying to reach Lexington, where Samuel Adams and John Hancock needed warning. Meanwhile, British regulars were beginning their march. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith commanded the expedition. Major John Pitcairn led the advance. The men were experienced soldiers, but the night worked against them. The troops had to cross water, organize in the dark, and move along roads that were already waking against them. Revere reached Lexington around midnight. Dawes arrived not long after. At the house where Hancock and Adams were staying, the warning was blunt. The regulars were out. Lexington's militia captain, John Parker, was already a sick man. He was worn by illness, but he was not timid. He gathered his company near Buckman Tavern, close to Lexington Green. These were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, tradesmen, fathers, sons, neighbors. They knew each other's faces. They knew whose houses stood near the green. They knew what the British army looked like, and they knew they could not defeat it in a formal fight. For a time it seemed uncertain whether the British were truly coming through Lexington. Parker dismissed some of his men, but ordered them to stay close. Revere and Dawes rode on toward Concord. Along the way, they met Dr. Samuel Prescott, a young physician who knew the local roads. British patrols intercepted them. Revere was captured. Dawes escaped, but was thrown from his horse and could not complete the ride. Prescott leapt a wall or fence, escaped into the dark, and carried the alarm to Concord. That detail matters. Concord was not warned by the lone rider of legend. It was warned because a wider system worked, because people beyond Boston were already prepared to respond, and because Prescott knew the countryside better than the patrols did. Across Middlesex County, alarm bells began to ring. Men rose from beds, muskets came down from walls, powder horns were filled. Wives, mothers, and children watched doors open before dawn, not knowing whether the men leaving would return by nightfall. The British expedition was still moving toward Concord, but it was no longer a secret march. At dawn on April 19, 1775, Lexington Green was cold, damp, and tense. Captain John Parker's militia stood in a small line, far outnumbered by the British advance. Parker did not intend to start a war. According to later memory, he told his men to stand their ground, not to fire unless fired upon, but if the British meant to have a war, it might begin there. Whether those exact words were spoken exactly that way matters less than what the scene reveals. Parker understood the danger. He wanted his men visible, not aggressive. The militia were asserting that their town was not empty, that British soldiers could not simply pass as if Massachusetts were silent. Major John Pitcairn and the British advance entered the Green. The regulars were tired, alert, and angry at the delays of the night. To them, armed men standing in formation looked like defiance. To the militia, the red-coated line looked like coercion made flesh. Someone shouted for the militia to disperse. Parker ordered his men to do so. They began to break apart. Then a shot rang out. No one knows with certainty who fired it. That uncertainty is one of the most important facts in American history. The first shot at Lexington has been claimed, denied, romanticized, investigated, and argued over for generations. It may have come from a nervous militiaman. It may have come from a British soldier. It may have come from somewhere outside the main lines. In that moment, amid smoke, shouting, and fear, the source disappeared into confusion. What followed was not uncertain. British regulars fired. The Lexington militia scattered. 8 Lexington men were killed or mortally wounded. Others were injured. The British officers struggled to restore order among their own troops. The Green, moments earlier a place of tense confrontation, became a place of bodies, smoke, and stunned witnesses. The British did not remain long. Concord was still the target. Smith's column continued west, leaving Lexington behind. But the meaning of the day had changed. Blood had been shed. Local men had died on their own green. News would travel faster than any official report. To the British commanders, Lexington may have seemed like an unfortunate incident on the way to the real mission. To the people of Massachusetts, it became a wound. By the time the regulars reached Concord, they were no longer merely marching to seize supplies. They were marching through a countryside that now had dead men to avenge. Concord had warning. By the time British troops arrived, many of the military stores had already been moved or hidden. Colonel James Barrett and others had helped disperse supplies to farms and safer locations. British soldiers searched the town. They found some materials and destroyed what they could. Smoke rose from the center of Concord, alarming militia gathered on the nearby heights. The smoke mattered because it looked like the town might be burning. At the North Bridge, a smaller British force guarded the crossing while other troops moved toward Barrett's farm. On the high ground beyond the bridge, militia from Concord and surrounding towns gathered in growing numbers. They could see British soldiers. They could see smoke. They could hear reports from men arriving along the roads. Among the militia was Captain Isaac Davis of Acton, a gunsmith and officer who had prepared his company carefully. His men carried bayonets, a detail that mattered because many militia did not. When the decision came to advance, Davis is remembered as saying he had not a man afraid to go. The militia moved down toward the bridge in column. Major John Buttrick of Concord was among the officers leading them. The British soldiers on the far side, under pressure and uncertain of the militia's intent, began to pull back. Shots were fired. Isaac Davis fell. Abner Hosmer, also from Acton, was killed. Luther Blanchard, the fifer, was wounded. For a moment, the militia saw their own men drop. Then Buttrick gave the order to fire. At Concord's North Bridge, colonial militia fired back at British regulars in organized resistance. The British force retreated from the bridge. It was not a large battle by later standards. The numbers were small. The bridge was modest. The fight lasted only minutes. But historically, it was immense. Lexington had been confusion and bloodshed during dispersal. Concord was different. Here, militia advanced, took fire, returned fire, and drove regulars back. In the surrounding farms and houses, civilians were drawn into the day in quieter ways. Families hid supplies. Women watched soldiers search property. Children heard gunfire across fields that had never been meant to become battlefields. The war was not arriving in abstract language. It was stepping into kitchens, barns, orchards, and roads. By late morning, Lieutenant Colonel Smith knew he had a problem. His men had completed only part of the mission. The countryside was fully alarmed. Militia numbers were rising. The road back to Boston would be long, and every mile might be contested. The British column began its return. The day was about to become a running battle. The road from Concord back toward Boston became a long, brutal corridor of smoke and fear. British regulars were trained for European-style warfare, but this was not a neat battlefield. The Massachusetts road bent between farms, stone walls, orchards, wooded patches, houses, and narrow crossings. Militia companies arrived from town after town, each group knowing local terrain better than the men they were attacking. At Merriam's Corner, as British flank guards rejoined the main column, militia opened fire. The retreat began to break into a pattern. British troops pushed forward, militia struck from cover, officers tried to maintain formation, and the column kept moving because stopping might invite disaster. The regulars were exhausted. Many had been marching since the night before. Their ammunition was not unlimited. Their wounded slowed them. Their anger grew. Houses along the road were searched or fired upon. Civilians were caught in the chaos. The fight spread through places whose names would become part of local memory. Brooks Hill, the Bloody Angle, Monotony. Monotony, now part of Arlington, saw some of the fiercest violence of the day. Fighting moved around houses and enclosed spaces. The line between battlefield and village disappeared. Some militia fought from behind walls and buildings. Some British soldiers, convinced they were being attacked from homes, entered houses with lethal force. By early afternoon, Smith's force was in danger of collapse. Then Lord Percy arrived with a relief column from Boston. Percy's men had marched out with artillery and fresh troops. Near Lexington, they formed a protective square and gave Smith's exhausted soldiers a chance to rest. For the British, Percy's arrival may have prevented catastrophe. But it did not end the fighting. The combined British force still had to return to Boston. Militia continued attacking along the road. Percy's troops used cannon to clear threats. Smoke rolled through villages. The wounded were carried or left behind. By the time the regulars reached the safety of Charlestown, the expedition had become something far larger than a failed seizure of supplies. The British had marched out to enforce authority. They returned to Boston under siege. The casualty figures shocked both sides. The British suffered heavily, the colonial militia suffered too, but the psychological result was unmistakable. British regulars had been hurt badly by local militia. Farmers and tradesmen had stood against imperial troops and survived the day. Across New England, men began moving toward Boston. Some came with muskets, some with old military experience, some with more confidence than discipline. They camped around the city in rough lines. They did not yet form a professional army, but they formed something Gage could not ignore. Boston, once the place from which British authority radiated outward, was now trapped. The war had begun. After Lexington and Concord, the geography of the conflict changed overnight. Boston sat on a peninsula, connected to the mainland by a narrow neck and surrounded by water. British troops controlled the town, the harbor, and the ships. But outside Boston, thousands of New England militia gathered in a loose ring. They came from Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. Their camps were improvised. Their supplies were uneven. Their command structure was imperfect. But they were there. General Artemus Ward held senior command among the Massachusetts forces. Israel Putnam, a veteran of earlier wars, became one of the famous faces of the siege. Joseph Warren, still technically a civilian leader for part of this period, moved between politics and military preparation with restless urgency. Inside Boston, Gage waited for reinforcements and tried to understand the scale of the crisis. The city contained loyalists, civilians, soldiers, refugees, and prisoners of circumstance. Food and movement were restricted. The harbor kept British power alive, but the countryside was no longer obedient. Then the war widened northward. On May 10th, the same day the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, a force associated with Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys moved against Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain. Benedict Arnold, acting under authority from Massachusetts, also pushed toward the fort. The two men were ambitious, proud, and difficult. Their cooperation was uneasy from the beginning. Fort Ticonderoga was not heavily defended. Its British garrison was small and surprised. The capture itself was quick, but the consequences were enormous. Ticonderoga held artillery. Cannon were the missing language of the siege of Boston. Militia with muskets could surround a city, but artillery could force a decision. The guns at Ticonderoga would later be hauled across winter roads by Henry Knox, a Boston bookseller with a gift for logistics and artillery. That future operation would help compel the British evacuation of Boston in 1776. In May 1775, that was still ahead. But the capture of Ticonderoga revealed something important. The war was not going to stay in one Massachusetts road. It was already spreading across lakes, forts, colonies, and ambitions. Benedict Arnold, in particular, enters the story here as a patriot hero in the making. It is tempting to let his later betrayal darken every scene he enters. But in 1775, Arnold was brave, energetic, and hungry for recognition. He saw possibilities quickly. He acted quickly. He also quarreled quickly. The revolution would attract men like that, men who could perform extraordinary service and carry extraordinary danger inside the same character. While armed men gathered around Boston, Delegates gathered in Philadelphia. The Second Continental Congress faced a crisis with no easy vocabulary. If they called the fighting rebellion, they risked confirming the harshest British accusations. If they treated it as a local disturbance, they ignored the reality of bloodshed and siege. If they did nothing, Massachusetts might fight alone. If they did too much, they might push the colonies beyond reconciliation. The delegates were not united. Some wanted stronger resistance. Some still hoped for peaceful settlement. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania represented the cautious, reconciliation-minded strain of thought. John Adams of Massachusetts pushed for decisive continental action. John Hancock, also of Massachusetts, became President of Congress, a signal that the colony at the center of the crisis would not be abandoned. The army outside Boston needed legitimacy. It also needed to become more than a New England force. That meant choosing a commander. George Washington of Virginia had attended Congress in military dress. He was tall, controlled, wealthy, and experienced from the French and Indian War, though his earlier military record was complicated. He was not the most experienced general available in a European sense, but he offered something politics needed as much as warfare did. He was from Virginia. Putting a Virginian in command of the forces around Boston helped transform the conflict from a Massachusetts cause into a continental one. It told New England that the southern colonies would share the burden. It told Britain that the resistance was not merely a Boston disorder. On June 15th, Congress chose Washington as commander-in-chief. On June 16th, he accepted in a speech carefully shaped by modesty and duty. He said he did not think himself equal to the command, and he asked not to profit from the office beyond his expenses. The words mattered because Washington understood performance. He knew he had to appear ambitious enough to command, but not so ambitious that Republican-minded men feared him. His self-control became part of his authority. But while Congress debated, events outside Boston were accelerating. British reinforcements had arrived, including Generals William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne. The British position in Boston was stronger than it had been in April. The Americans surrounding the town wanted to prevent the British from breaking out and occupying the high ground around the harbor. The Charlestown Peninsula became the next flashpoint. The heights there overlooked Boston and the harbor. If colonial forces fortified them, the British could not ignore it. If the British allowed it, their position in Boston would become more dangerous. On the night of June 16th, colonial troops moved onto the peninsula. They were supposed to fortify Bunker Hill. Instead, they built their main redoubt on Breed's Hill, closer to Boston and more provocative. By morning, British officers looked across the water and saw earthworks where none had been the day before. The battle that followed would be remembered by the wrong hill's name, but no one would mistake its significance. June 17, 1775, was hot, smoky, and terrifying. On Breed's Hill, colonial troops worked with shovels, picks, and exhausted hands to strengthen the redoubt they had thrown up overnight. Colonel William Prescott played a central role in holding the position. Israel Putnam moved through the wider defenses. John Stark brought New Hampshire men to the rail fence, a position that would become crucial because it extended the American line and helped protect the flank. Across the water, the British prepared to attack. General William Howe would lead the assault. The British plan was direct: land troops on the Charlestown Peninsula, advance uphill, and drive the provincials from the works. British commanders believed discipline, bayonets, and artillery would decide the issue. They had reason to think so. They were professional soldiers, facing men many officers still dismissed as irregulars. But the Americans had terrain, cover, and desperation. Charlestown began to burn. British guns fired from ships and batteries. Smoke rose behind the battlefield, turning the peninsula into a stage of flame and powder haze. Civilians watched from Boston rooftops and distant hills. This was not a skirmish on a country road. It was a public battle, visible to thousands. The first British assault moved forward in ordered lines. Red coats advanced over fences, grass, and uneven ground toward men waiting behind earth and rail. The Americans held fire until the range was close. Then they fired into the advancing line. The British fell back. Howe reformed his men and attacked again. Again, the defenders poured fire into the assault. Officers went down, soldiers stepped over bodies. The heat, smoke, noise, and slope made every yard costly. The British fell back a second time. For the Americans, ammunition was becoming the deciding fact. Courage could not replace powder. Muskets without cartridges became clubs. The defenders had held against 2 assaults, but their supply was running out. On the third attack, the British concentrated against the redoubt. Bayonets mattered now. Many Americans lacked them. The fighting became close and violent. The defenders began to withdraw. British troops finally took the position. Technically, Bunker Hill was a British victory. But it was a victory that felt like a warning. British casualties were staggering. Many officers were killed or wounded. The cost shocked the army and the empire. The Americans had lost the ground, but they had proven something London could not easily dismiss. Colonial forces, if protected by earthworks and commanded with determination, would stand against regulars in a pitched battle. The dead included Dr. Joseph Warren, who had accepted a general's commission but fought as a volunteer in the redoubt. His death became a patriot martyrdom. Major John Pitcairn, present at Lexington, was mortally wounded. Black soldiers, including men later remembered as Peter Salem and Salem Poor, were part of the Patriot fighting force. Their exact actions have been debated, but their presence matters because the Revolution's promise and contradictions were already standing in the same smoke. Bunker Hill changed assumptions. British commanders understood the war would not be cheap. American leaders understood bravery alone would not be enough. They needed command, supply, discipline, powder, artillery, and time. George Washington was on his way to inherit that problem. George Washington reached Cambridge in early July and took command on July 3, 1775. The army he found was passionate, brave, and dangerously fragile. It was not yet the Continental Army of later memory. It was a collection of provincial forces with different enlistments, habits, officers, uniforms, supplies, and expectations. Men came and went. Some obeyed local leaders more readily than distant authority. Camp sanitation was poor, powder was scarce. Discipline had to be built without crushing the volunteer spirit that had brought the men there in the first place. Washington understood that command was not only giving orders, it was creating legitimacy. He had to persuade New England troops to accept a Virginian commander. He had to persuade Congress to send money, supplies, and authority. He had to watch British forces in Boston without launching a reckless attack. He had to make an army appear stronger than it was. Powder shortage was one of his deepest anxieties. An army surrounding Boston without enough gunpowder was a bluff that could become a disaster if exposed. Washington and his officers had to conceal weakness while searching for supplies. He also had to think politically. The men outside Boston were fighting under the eyes of colonies that had not yet declared independence. Every decision carried meaning. Too much aggression could frighten moderates. Too little could embolden British commanders. Desertion, disorder, or failure might damage the cause more than a lost battle. Washington's command style emerged under pressure. Formal, controlled, image-conscious, often frustrated, sometimes severe. He believed discipline was liberty's guardrail, not its enemy. An army that behaved like a mob would lose both military effectiveness and moral authority. Around Boston, siege life settled into a strange rhythm. Men drilled, dug, waited, fell ill, wrote letters, watched British lines, listened for rumors, wondered whether their enlistments would end before the war did. Inside Boston, British soldiers and civilians endured their own confinement. Loyalists feared Patriot revenge if the town fell. Patriots trapped inside feared British suspicion. The siege was not a simple ring of good men around bad men. It was a city of divided loyalties surrounded by an army still learning how to exist. In Philadelphia, Congress continued trying to hold together two ideas that were becoming harder to reconcile. They were fighting, and they were still petitioning. In July 1775, the Continental Congress adopted the Olive Branch Petition. The petition appealed directly to King George III, asking for reconciliation and relief from the crisis. To modern ears, it can sound almost impossible. How could men authorize military resistance and still ask the king for peace? But that contradiction was 1775. Many colonists still distinguished between the king and parliament, between imperial corruption and royal justice, between resistance and independence. They believed or hoped that if the king understood their grievances, he might intervene. John Dickinson and other moderates saw petitioning as morally and politically necessary. Even men more skeptical of reconciliation understood that the colonies had to show they had not rushed toward rebellion. At nearly the same time, Congress issued the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. Its message was firm. The colonies were not seeking conquest or domination, but they would defend their liberties by force if necessary. To Britain, these distinctions looked increasingly hollow. Armed men were besieging a British army. Forts had been seized. Royal authority had collapsed across much of Massachusetts. Whatever language Congress used, rebellion seemed to be happening in practice. In August, King George III issued a proclamation declaring the colonies in a state of open rebellion. That response made reconciliation far less likely. The emotional break was not yet complete for everyone, but the political path back was narrowing. This is one reason 1775 should not be treated as merely a prelude to 1776. It was the year in which Americans learned that events could outrun intentions. A man could begin the year asking for rights as an Englishman and end it drilling under a Continental Commission. A delegate could sign a petition for peace while voting to supply an army. A royal official could insist on obedience while losing practical control of the countryside. The empire and the colonies were no longer arguing in pamphlets alone. They were arguing through logistics, muskets, hunger, fear, and command. And beyond New England and Philadelphia, the war's meaning was becoming still more complicated. In Virginia, Lord Dunmore would make a proclamation that forced patriots to confront a reality many preferred to keep outside the language of liberty. Enslaved people were watching the war too. In November 1775, John Murray, Lord Dunmore, Royal Governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation from aboard a British ship. Virginia had been sliding toward conflict. Dunmore had clashed with patriot leaders, removed gunpowder from Williamsburg, and retreated from the capital. From the water, backed by British naval power, he tried to regain leverage. His proclamation declared martial law and offered freedom to enslaved people and indentured servants belonging to rebels if they joined the king's forces. The offer was limited. It did not free all enslaved people. It did not apply to those owned by loyalists. It was a wartime measure designed to weaken rebels and strengthen British arms. But for enslaved people living under rebel masters, it opened a dangerous possibility. Freedom could be pursued through the chaos of empire. For Virginia patriots, Dunmore's proclamation was terrifying. It threatened property, social order, military security, and the racial system at the heart of plantation wealth. Men who spoke loudly of liberty now faced enslaved people who might define liberty differently and act on that definition. This is not a side story. It belongs at the center of 1775 because it reveals the Revolution's fracture lines. The war was about constitutional rights, imperial power, taxation, representation, local self-government, and military coercion. It was also about slavery, loyalty, escape, fear, and opportunity. Some enslaved people fled to British lines. Some would serve in units associated with Dunmore. Disease and hardship would kill many. British promises could be strategic and unreliable, but they were still promises made in a world where patriot liberty often excluded the enslaved. The Revolution was becoming a war in which different people heard different meanings in the same words. Liberty to a Massachusetts militiaman might mean protection from parliamentary overreach. Liberty to a Virginia planter might mean self-government without imperial interference. Liberty to an enslaved man or woman might mean crossing water at night toward the uniform of the king. 1775 did not resolve those contradictions. It exposed them. And while Virginia faced its own crisis, American leaders were already attempting something bold, risky, and premature. They were carrying the war into Canada. The invasion of Canada was born from strategy, hope, and miscalculation. American leaders feared that British forces might use Canada as a base to strike south along the Lake Champlain-Hudson corridor, splitting New England from the other colonies. They also hoped French-speaking Canadians might join or at least tolerate the American cause. If Canada could be brought into the resistance, the war's northern frontier would transform. Two American movements developed. One force, associated with Philip Schuyler and then Richard Montgomery, pushed north through Lake Champlain toward Montreal. Another, led by Benedict Arnold, would attempt a brutal march through the Maine wilderness toward Quebec. Montgomery was capable, brave, and respected. Arnold was relentless, ambitious, and almost terrifyingly energetic. Together, though not always physically together, they represented the American gamble in the North. The campaign had moments of success. Forts fell. Montreal was captured in November. British Governor Guy Carleton narrowly escaped and moved toward Quebec, the strongest position in the region. Arnold's march through Maine became one of the harsh ordeals of the early war. Men dragged boats through wilderness, crossed swamps, fought hunger, sickness, cold, bad maps, and exhaustion. Supplies spoiled or ran out. Some turned back. Those who continued staggered toward the St. Lawrence, half-starved and worn down. Arnold reached the outskirts of Quebec with men who had endured almost more than an army could reasonably be asked to endure. Montgomery joined him after Montreal. The combined American force faced a hard problem. Quebec was fortified, winter was closing in, enlistments were expiring, and time favored the defenders. Carleton prepared the city. The Americans lacked heavy artillery sufficient to batter their way in. A siege through winter would be difficult. Waiting might dissolve the army. So they chose assault. The date would be December 31st, 1775. The weather would be a snowstorm. The plan required columns to move through darkness, wind, and narrow approaches beneath the city's defenses. Montgomery would attack from one direction, Arnold from another. If they could break through the lower town and link up, perhaps Quebec might fall. It was bold, it was desperate, and it would end 1775 not with triumph, but with blood in the snow. Before dawn on December 31st, American troops moved through a blizzard toward Quebec. Snow and wind reduced visibility. Muskets were difficult to keep dry. Men stumbled along icy paths beneath dark walls and cliffs. The city above them was awake enough. Guy Carleton's defenders were ready. Richard Montgomery led his column along the riverside. He had already achieved real success in the campaign, but Quebec was different. As his men advanced toward a barricade, defenders opened fire. Montgomery was killed. His leading officers fell with him. The column faltered and withdrew. Benedict Arnold's column fought into the lower town from another direction. Arnold was wounded in the leg and carried from the fight, but his men pressed on under Daniel Morgan, a tough rifleman leader from Virginia. Morgan and his soldiers pushed forward through streets, barriers, and confusion. For a moment, the attack still had life, but without Montgomery's column, without coordination, and with defenders closing in, the Americans were trapped. Morgan's men were surrounded. Many were captured. The assault failed. Quebec did not fall. The defeat was severe. Montgomery was dead. Arnold was wounded. Morgan was a prisoner. Hundreds of Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. The survivors outside the city were left to maintain a difficult position in winter, far from easy supply, with sickness and expiring enlistments threatening the campaign. It was a grim ending to a year that had begun with farmers gathering before dawn on Lexington Green. And yet, even failure at Quebec revealed how far the conflict had moved. In April, the crisis was whether British troops could seize stores in Concord. By December, American forces had invaded another British province and tried to take one of its strongest cities. The scale of imagination had changed. The men beneath Quebec's walls were not fighting in defense of one Massachusetts town. They were part of a continental war whose goals were still forming, whose politics were still unstable, and whose human cost was rising every month. 1775 ended in uncertainty. Boston was still occupied. Washington's army still lacked everything it needed. Congress had not declared independence. The king had declared rebellion. Enslaved people in Virginia had been offered a path toward freedom through British lines. Canada had not joined the American cause. The British army had not been defeated. The Americans had not been crushed. There was no clear end in sight. There was only the knowledge that the old relationship had been broken by gunfire, siege, proclamation, and winter assault. The American Revolution did not become inevitable in a single instant. Not at Lexington, not at Concord, not at Bunker Hill, not in Congress, not at Quebec. It became harder to stop through accumulation, a shot no one could identify. 8 dead men on Lexington Green, militia firing back at North Bridge, British troops bleeding along Battle Road. Boston surrounded, Ticonderoga seized, Congress choosing Washington, Charlestown burning, Warren dead, the king declaring rebellion, Dunmore offering freedom to the enslaved of rebels, Montgomery falling in the snow. Each event narrowed the path back. That is the power of 1775. It shows revolution before certainty. It shows people acting before they fully understand what their actions will require. It shows courage mixed with fear, principle mixed with self-interest, liberty mixed with exclusion, and hope mixed with violence. The men and women who lived through that year did not know they were entering the first chapter of a national origin story. They knew the road to Concord. They knew the sound of bells. They knew the smell of powder. They knew the sight of soldiers in their streets, delegates in heated rooms, ships in the harbor, and snow on the walls of Quebec. By the end of 1775, America was not independent. But it was armed, and once a people has fired, buried its dead, built an army, and watched the king call it rebellion, the future becomes harder to negotiate back into the past. The next year would bring Thomas Paine's Common Sense, the guns of Dorchester Heights, the British evacuation of Boston, the Declaration of Independence, the disaster in New York, and the desperate crossing of the Delaware. But before 1776 could declare a nation, 1775 had to make retreat impossible. This was the year America took up arms.